The following clip is from the North to South Show, live every Monday and Wednesday at 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, where we talk SEC football everything. Now, we'd love to have you out for next show, but for now, hit that like button down below, hit that subscribe button, and enjoy this clip. Here we go. We are on our last segment now, and I will be breaking down the top 10 biggest impactful SEC football games, all SEC football games of the year. Now, straight off the bat, you're going to notice I'm wearing different clothes and everything like that, and that is because my microphone was screwed up, and luckily it only affected the intro of this segment, so we're still going to get a clean output of my whole rankings and everything like that, but for that reason I have to redo my intro. So what this segment is going to be, all SEC games. So you're not going to have your Georgia Clemson, you're not going to have Penn State Auburn, you're not going to have Texas Arkansas. There's not going to be any games like that. It's only SEC versus SEC games. And what I mean by biggest or most impactful, that doesn't mean it's going to be the best games of the season. Biggest and most impactful, I mean, is by how these games will affect the total outcome or the total final standings of the SEC this season. So the games that will impact that the most is what I have in this top 10. I still think that there's some games that aren't on this list that I think will be very, very competitive and a lot better of an actual game from an actual game perspective than some of the games you're going to see in this list. Like, for example, I think a game like you take Ole Miss and Arkansas this season, I think will be a competitive game, a really interesting game. I think Missouri and Kentucky will be a really, really good game this year. I think like South Carolina, Tennessee will be a good game this year. There's lots of games that I think that are going to be good games that aren't on this list, because this isn't what I think the 10 best games are going to be. This is the 10 most impactful games on the SEC final standings. So without further ado, let me take you to my top 10 most impactful games of the SEC football season. So let's start off with number 10. At number 10, I have Ole Miss going to Alabama. We all know what happened last year. Is a very close game. I'm pretty sure that was like week 3 of the college football season, or week 3 of the SEC football season, And Ole Miss was able to run up the scoreboard on Alabama. Now, Alabama did come out of that game with a win, but other than the Florida game, I think that this was by far Alabama's closest game of the whole season. Now, Ole Miss does travel to Alabama this season, and that's why you see this lower on the list. That's why you see it just barely squeaking in at the number 10 spot. But let's say Lane Kiffin works some magic and is able to go into Alabama and come out of there with a big upset or something like that. How much of an impact would that have on the top half of the SEC West standings? It would be huge. First of all, Alabama obviously creates a huge hole for Texas A&M to go in and come out with an SEC West championship win. Second of all, Ole Miss is suddenly in the conversation. Easily Ole Miss is in the conversation. They're looking like SEC West contenders. I think if Ole Miss is able to go into Alabama and knock them off, which is unlikely at this current time, it's going to shake up the SEC a lot. At number 9, I have an interesting one, and this is a game that personally I'm interested in, and I think that it will really see as it finishes up. I know it's towards the end of the season, but this will really show how the SEC East standings are going to end, and I have Florida going to Missouri. I think Missouri is going to be a very competitive team in the SEC East this year, and I honestly think that this game in general is going to be a very competitive game and ultimately decide who is going to be the second best team in the SEC East. Or maybe, let's say Georgia, something crazy happens to them and they're not playing up to par. This is a late season game that you could see come down to determine that SEC East champion. Depends, of course, on the dependent variable of Georgia and how Georgia's playing this season and everything like that. So Florida at Missouri, I think, will determine who's going to be the second best team or finish in that number 2 spot in the SEC East. But I think that is going to be a very interesting game in determining the SEC East. At number 8, I have Georgia at Auburn, and you're going to kind of see for the same thing at number 7. At number 8, Georgia at Auburn. Auburn going to Auburn, we've seen it in past years so many different times with both Georgia and Alabama when both of those teams go on to play in Jordan-Hare Stadium. Crazy things happen. The craziest of things happen that usually shake up the SEC standings. And let's say Auburn is able to go out and knock off Georgia. Again, Georgia has to travel on the road in this game. They're at Auburn, which is not an easy place to play. Let's say Auburn does knock them off. That would create a hole maybe in the East for a Missouri or a Florida to jump up. And this kind of leads me into my number 7. I'm going to talk about the same thing when I have Alabama traveling to Auburn at my number 7 spot. Let's say Auburn works their magic the last week of the season and they knock off Alabama or something like that. And let's say Alabama already had a loss to an SEC team. Let's say Texas A&M jumps up in that number 1 spot. Again, this is the last game of the season. The Iron Bowl is going to be the last game of the season for both of these teams. And maybe it just shakes up the West at the very last moments to go on and just create an amazing finish to a SEC season that we did not see coming. So 7 and 8, again, both of those are unlikely. I do see Georgia and Alabama going out and winning both of those games, but you always know that expect the unexpected in Jordan-Hare Stadium, especially when Alabama and Georgia do come into there. So that could really shake up the SEC standings on both sides, the East and the West, if Georgia and Alabama were to lose those games. At number 6, I have Texas A&M going to Ole Miss. Texas A&M, other than Alabama, is going to be your most competitive team and your hardest team to beat in the SEC West. They're a team that's looking to go out and win the SEC West this season. And in their way, they travel to Oxford, Mississippi for a team that offensively is really, really good. They're going to test that Texas A&M defense. Obviously, defensively, there is some struggles for Ole Miss, but Ole Miss is going to be a very competitive team, and they're going to be a team, if anyone's going to shock off your Alabamas or Texas A&Ms this season, that is not going to be those two. It's not going to be in the Alabama-Texas A&M game. I have Ole Miss. It's going to be Ole Miss or LSU probably. Ole Miss is going to be a very competitive team, and when you have to travel on the road to Mississippi this season, which they just announced, I'm pretty sure this week that the Grove will open in Ole Miss this season. I know that has nothing to do with the inside part of the game, but the outside part of the game, the tailgating and everything like that. Great news for Ole Miss fans, but I think this game could play a major role on Texas A&M's chances on going out and winning an SEC West, let's say if Ole Miss was to go off and knock off Texas A&M. Number 5, I have LSU at Alabama. Obviously, LSU came in last time to Alabama and won the game. Now, you don't have Joe Burrow, you don't have Jamar Chase, you don't have Justin Jefferson, you don't have Clyde Edwards-Helaire, you don't have Caleb Chase on, you don't have Grant Delpit, you don't have who else could you go with? Patrick Queen. There's so many different guys that I could name that you don't have that you did have in that game, but LSU still has talent on that football team. We cannot forget about that. Now, I do think Alabama is better, and you do play in Alabama. I think this game is very different if you have to travel to LSU. If they had full fans, because last season, obviously, they didn't, and I still think Alabama comes out with the win, but I think it makes the game a bit tougher because Bama really did control that game from the beginning, but I still think if LSU is really rolling at this point of the season and they have to go to Alabama, maybe they shock them off and it could really shake up how that SEC West looks. At number 4, kind of the same thing. I have Texas A&M going to LSU. Now let's put ourselves in this scenario that, let's say Texas A&M does go out and beat Alabama in their big game in College Station. Now let's say, remember that Texas A&M Ole Miss game that I talked about earlier. Let's say Ole Miss is able to shock them off, and Alabama's won out the rest of their schedule. So you have Texas A&M and Alabama both sitting with one loss, and let's say Alabama also wins that Auburn game in the last game of the season. We know that these Texas A&M and LSU games have been very competitive in the past, and you do have to travel to Death Valley, LSU for this game for Texas A&M. This could be a game to determine who is the SEC West champion, especially more on the Texas A&M side and LSU side, just knocking them off. And I don't want to say you're basically putting Alabama into the SEC championship, but you're never trying to lose games. So it could create for a very interesting, maybe this takes the CBS spot over, let's say, Alabama and Auburn, because you just have a really, really, really high caliber game at this moment and a really, really, really high impact. That's what we're going for. That's the word I'm looking for. So that my number 4, I have A&M at LSU, which is going to be interesting. Number 3, I have the biggest cross-divisional game of the whole season. Bama at Florida. I mean, this game was really, really hyped up. It's been really, really hyped up this season. I do think it's Bama's to win, but, man, you still have to travel to Florida. I think if this game's in Alabama, you're talking about a completely different situation, but you have to travel to Florida. Florida is an underrated team this year. As much as they did lose, I still think that they have a lot of talent, especially offensively. I'm excited to see what Emory Jones is able to go over and start there in Gainesville when he takes it over as his Florida Gators team. It's an early Week 3 game, And this, I tell you, if Florida does go out and beat Alabama, it's going to shake everything up, because then Texas A&M is going to be really talked about as the SEC West champion. You're going to have Florida, lots of people saying, oh, Florida's better than Georgia now, and then that Georgia and Florida game is going to be worth a lot more. So that game could have a lot of meaning for a early SEC cross-divisional game. So that's at my number 3 spot. Number 2, I just mentioned it. I have Georgia and Florida, and these 1-2 games are basically my expectation for the top 2 teams in each division going at it. So Georgia versus Florida, obviously a neutral site game, which is going to be played in Jacksonville, as it always is. This is basically going to determine who wins the SEC East. It has the last couple seasons. Obviously, last season, Florida was able to go off and knock off Georgia. I think you're looking at the same scenario there. Whoever wins this game wins the SEC East, and that is a big an impact as it gets. Like, if whoever wins that game wins the division, you go on to the SEC championship. Big impact. Nothing more needs to be said about that game. And then obviously at number 1, not hard to guess with what I just talked about. The 2 best teams in the West going at it, in my opinion, in this current moment. Alabama traveling to Texas A&M. Now, this game is a lot more interesting because it's not in a neutral site, and you do have Alabama traveling to Texas A&M College Station, which is going to be a very loud and intense environment, because Texas A&M knows that what's at stake. Alabama knows what's at stake, and it should be a very competitive game. I know Alabama's looking really solid. They still have a couple young guys who are going on. Obviously, Bryce Young's taking over the team. For his first year of fully starting at Alabama, you're going to have Haynes King doing the same thing. But this should be a very competitive game, and definitely, I think, the game that will mainly determine how the SEC shapes up at the end of the season.